I spent about 2 months digging into this one. And I'll be honest, it started from the wrong place. I was chasing a story about Australian truck drivers refusing armored windshields in Phuoc Tuy, and I couldn't pin it down. What I found instead was something far stranger and more revealing. Australian armoured crews, men riding the most heavily protected vehicles in the 1st Australian Task Force, were systematically stripping protection off their vehicles within weeks of arriving in country, with headquarters watching. And when I finally understood why, I understood something fundamental about what the Australians knew that the conventional military world didn't. Protection, the wrong kind of protection in the wrong environment, wasn't saving lives. It was setting traps. Route 2, Phuoc Tuy Province, June 6, 1969. 800 hours. A 53-ton Centurion tank is moving north. The morning air is already thick. That particular Vietnamese humidity that sits on your skin before the sun has even had a chance to turn the rubber plantation rows into green corridors of shadow and heat. The crew commander is scanning the road, the tree line, the village of Binh coming up on the left. 5 kilometers from home, a routine run to support 6 RAR in a contact to the north. What I found next, reading through the after-action reports 50 years later, stopped me cold. The RPG comes out of the rubber trees with almost no warning. Close range. The rocket strikes the Centurion's turret squarely, jamming the whole assembly, wounding the radio operator. And there is the crew commander, sitting exposed above his cupola, head and shoulders above the steel, directing the vehicle, watching the road, doing exactly what his training told him to do. Not sealed inside. Not protected. Exposed. Later that morning, 2nd Lieutenant Brian Sullivan will be doing the same thing, directing his troop from the cupola, when an RPG 7-round fires at him point blank. He ducks. The tail fins graze his back. He survives by inches. This is the image I could not shake. The most powerful vehicles in the Australian Task Force. 53 tons of British engineering, and the men inside were deliberately riding with their heads out. Not because they had to, because they had decided to. Because the alternative, sealed inside, armored, protected, blind, had proved more dangerous than the bullet. I want to tell you what I found when I started pulling on that thread. When the announcement came in October 1967 that Prime Minister Harold Holt's government would send a squadron of Centurion tanks to reinforce Australian forces in South Vietnam, the reaction was almost universally dismissive. The critics lined up immediately. Military analysts, journalists, and, what surprised me most, a significant number of voices inside the Royal Australian Armoured Corps itself. The Centurion was a British tank designed for the plains of Northern Europe. It weighed 52 tons. It drank fuel at a pace that made logistics officers wince. South Vietnam, the critics argued, was precisely the wrong theater for such a machine. Critics said the 52-ton beasts would bog down in the steamy, soggy Southeast Asian country. A contemporary Australian War Memorial newsreel recorded that they would be restricted to base areas, and even if they could work outside, they would not be able to keep up with the infantry. The mockery had already found its name. The Centurions were called Koalas, the quiet, cuddly creatures that, according to Australian wildlife laws, were not to be shot at, and according to the critics, not to be sent overseas either. There was something almost affectionate in the joke, but underneath it was a serious professional argument. These vehicles were too big, too slow, and too valuable to risk in a guerrilla war they were not designed to fight. This institutional skepticism ran deep. The Australians had been operating in Phuoc Tuy Province since April 1966. and their doctrine was built around the infantry. Deliberate patrolling, careful ambush, intelligence-driven operations. Tanks belonged to another kind of war. Even the first Australian Task Force's operational experience with the M113 armored personnel carrier, a vehicle far better suited to the jungle than the Centurion, had delivered mixed results. PCs had been useful. They had also been vulnerable. Mines had shredded them. RPG rounds had penetrated their thin aluminium hulls. The question of how much armor was actually helping and how much it was creating false confidence was already alive in the minds of the men operating in Phuoc Tuy. What no one had yet fully articulated, what I found buried in the modifications and the after-action reports and the veteran accounts, was that the question wasn't really about whether to use armor. It was about what kind of protection actually protected you in a jungle counterinsurgency. And the answer the Australians were about to discover was that the protection that had been designed in Britain, packed up in Sydney, and shipped to Vietnam bore almost no relationship to the protection you actually needed in the rubber plantations and scrub of Phuoc Tuy Province. Reading through the reports leading up to the Centurion deployment, I kept finding two things in tension. On one side, the institutional confidence in heavy armor as a life-saving technology. On the other, the accumulating field experience that the jungle was not cooperating with the doctrine. Operations Binh and Renmark in February 1967 had each, in different ways, shown what happened when the protection you were relying on failed you. 8 dead and 27 wounded at Binh, 7 dead and 26 wounded at Renmark, all victims of mines and booby traps. The rate of losses, and the manner of them, was forcing a rethink. Into this environment, in February 1968, arrived the Centurions, exactly as they had been designed, exactly as they had been shipped, with every feature their British engineers had specified. Within weeks, the crews had started taking them apart. To understand what happened, you have to understand what a Centurion actually looked like when it arrived in Vietnam. The Australian Mark V/1 Centurions had been modified before embarkation at the 4th Base Workshops in Bandiana. Engineers had added a large external 450-liter fuel tank to extend the vehicle's range. The main gun system had been upgraded. A ranging .50 caliber heavy machine gun had been mounted next to the 20-pounder main gun. An infrared illumination system had been installed for improved night capability. The frontal hull had received additional armor plating. Carefully bolted over the tracks on each side were the protective armored side skirts, metal panels designed to shield the suspension and running gear from shrapnel and small arms fire, a feature borrowed directly from European tank doctrine. It was, in every formal sense, a properly equipped fighting vehicle. It had been designed and modified by people who knew their profession, and it was almost immediately profoundly wrong for the environment it had arrived in. The armored side skirts were the first to go. The side skirts were removed after only a few outings, one account records, because they compacted mud and vegetation around the suspension, causing idler wheels to shatter and distorting the fluted sheet metal guards, often causing the hull bins to break open and spill out their contents. The jungle did not care about European ballistic protection doctrine. The dense vegetation and saturated soil of Phuoc Tuy Province found every gap between armored panel and track, every point where steel met mud, and turned each one into a mechanical failure waiting to happen. The side skirts, designed to protect, were destroying the vehicles from the inside. The headlights came next. Jungle vegetation was simply ripping them off during patrols. Repair crews worked overtime refitting them, fighting a losing battle, until the answer became obvious. Remove them. Replace the headlight positions on the glacis plate with mounting points for spare road wheels, which, as someone noticed, were also providing a useful additional layer of frontal protection against RPG rounds. The improvisation was elegant in the way that battlefield improvisations often are. The thing that replaced the thing that didn't work turned out to work better than the original. The smoke dischargers went. The IR lamp was stripped. The track guards were replaced with heavy-gauge steel plate that could actually handle the vegetation without being torn apart. Storage racks were welded to the back of the turret so crews could carry spare ammunition and an additional radio. Because the other critical problem was that the tanks couldn't communicate with the infantry they were supposed to support. The standard radios were not compatible. Someone borrowed a U.S. Army AN/PRC-25 set and bolted it to the outside of a cupola. It worked, so they did it again and again. What the crews in the RAEME mechanics and the light aid detachment were doing, modification by modification, operation by operation, was rebuilding the Centurion from scratch. Not randomly, not carelessly. They were stripping away everything that impeded the tank's ability to function in this jungle, on these roads, against this enemy. And keeping everything and improvising everything else that actually kept the crew alive and the vehicle moving and the guns pointing at the right targets. The M113 story ran in parallel, and in some ways was even more revealing. The armored personnel carriers had deployed to Vietnam in 1965 with their crews positioned in relatively exposed positions behind a .50 caliber machine gun and a simple pintle mount. Early combat experience showed the crew commander was dangerously vulnerable. So the Australians began an iterative process of developing gun shields and turret configurations, trying the Model 74C cupola, then standardizing on the Cadillac Gauge T50 turret with twin .30 caliber Browning machine guns. The T50 offered real protection. It was also, in the field, problematic, cramped, slow to rotate, making it genuinely difficult to keep the guns aimed while the vehicle was moving. The tension was fundamental. More protection meant less responsiveness. Less responsiveness in an ambush meant you were slower to engage the enemy who had just announced himself by firing at you. In a jungle counterinsurgency, that fraction of a second was the difference that mattered. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong understood this better than any engineer drawing up specifications in Canberra or Detroit. They had been fighting this kind of war for a generation. They knew that the vehicle sealed inside its own protection, unable to see clearly, unable to swivel its weapons fast enough, was not a threat to be feared. The vehicle whose crew could see, whose commander was scanning arcs with his eyes instead of a periscope, whose gunner could traverse in under a second. That was the vehicle that killed people. May 1968. The battles of Koalas and Balmoral. This is where I found the story turning on its axis. C Squadron, 1st Armored Regiment, had been operating for only a few months. The modifications were already underway. The side skirts stripped, the headlights repositioned, the radios borrowed from the Americans. On May 22nd, the squadron began a 120-kilometer road march from Nui Dat to Fire Support Base Coral, losing a bulldozer to a mine on the way. By May 23rd, the tanks were in position. What followed in the next 6 weeks would rewrite Australian armoured doctrine for the rest of the war. The North Vietnamese were attacking in regimental force. The 141st and 165th NVA regiments hit Coral and Balmoral in repeated, determined assaults. The kind of massed infantry attacks that the Centurion had theoretically been designed for, and yet which no one had expected to encounter in Phuoc Tuy Province. The tanks that critics had called mobile pillboxes, useless in jungle, too slow to keep up with infantry, were suddenly the most important assets on the battlefield. On May 28th, at Balmoral, an NVA regiment attacked. The Centurions' firepower broke the assault. On May 30th, 2 infantry platoons patrolling from Coral became pinned down against enemy bunkers. The M113 APCs were unable to reach them. The jungle was too dense, even for the tracks. 2 Centurions were sent through the heavy scrub, moving at times as slowly as 500 meters per hour, crashing through vegetation that would have stopped any other vehicle. They reached the pinned Australians. The Centurion crews fired everything they had, one account records: canister, solid shot and high explosive shells, and machine guns. Each shell cleared more jungle and opened up further targets. The platoon was extracted. What I found in the records of Corporal Balmoral that changed my understanding of this story was not the firepower. It was the awareness. In the after-action analysis, the Australian commanders who had watched the tanks operate noted something that the critics had completely missed. The Centurion crews were not successful because they were sealed inside impenetrable armor. They were successful because they understood the relationship between their steel and their senses. The modifications had not left the tanks more vulnerable. They had left the crews more functional, able to see farther, traverse faster, communicate better, and keep moving through terrain that would have halted a tank still carrying all the equipment designed for European planes. The Viet Cong and NVA were paying attention too. After the battles of Coral and Balmoral, the enemy began a systematic research program of their own. The Viet Cong are taking pains to learn their measure, a contemporary AWM account reported. They now have a rocket-propelled grenade capable of penetrating armor. But it took them 13 months, and it took about 12 months to determine the size of mine required to stop the tanks. The enemy needed more than a year to develop weapons effective against vehicles the critics had called sitting targets. That is a remarkable statistic, and I spent some time with it. It means the Australian crews, operating in stripped, improvised, modified vehicles that bore little resemblance to their factory specification, were harder to kill than the theory predicted. Then came Binh, June 6, 1969. The moment Brian Sullivan exposed himself above his cupola was not an accident or a failure of discipline. It was doctrine. Australian commanders had learned, through the brutal specificity of Phuoc Tuy combat, that the crew commander needed to see. Not through a periscope, not through a narrow armored vision slit designed for a different war. With his eyes scanning the arc, reading the foliage, watching the way the shadows moved in the rubber trees. The fraction of a second that awareness provided was the fraction that kept Sullivan alive, even when the RPG tail fins grazed his back. "We should never leave home without them," one of the commanders said after Binh, talking about the tanks. And by this point in my research, I understood what they meant, not just the firepower, but the adapted firepower. The tanks that had been stripped and rebuilt and modified until they fit the war they were actually fighting, rather than the war they had been designed for. By the conclusion of Operation Hammer, 1 Australian had been killed and 10 wounded. The North Vietnamese had lost 99 men confirmed killed. 4 Centurions had been damaged by RPG fire, and the majority of the Australian wounded were tank commanders and crewmen, men riding exposed. The arithmetic is striking. The most vulnerable positions, by any European armor doctrine, produce the most effective results, by any counterinsurgency standard. The modifications did not stop at Corporal Balmoral or Binh. They evolved continuously through each squadron rotation, each unit bringing its own accumulated lessons, and each RAMI detachment adding refinements. By 1969 to 1970, the RAMI had standardized what had begun as improvisations. Heavy gauge steel plate replaced the fragile track guards that the jungle kept destroying. Additional water containers were added. Small, practical, keeping crews functional in the 40-degree tropical heat that turned the interior of a closed Centurion into something approaching an industrial oven. The tanks had started carrying extra road wheels on the glacis plate. a fix for the rubber degradation caused by constant high-temperature running. This too had turned out to provide genuine ballistic protection. Spare wheels on the front hull deflecting RPG rounds in at least several documented engagements. The improvised communication solution, a borrowed U.S. Army PRC-25 radio bolted to the outside of the cupola, became something close to standard practice. This was not a trivial adaptation. The entire Australian doctrine of combined arms operations, tank and infantry working together, supporting each other, coordinating fires, depended on the ability to communicate. The original radios couldn't talk to the infantry sections walking beside and behind the tanks. Someone fixed it with a borrowed radio and a welded bracket. That fix may have saved more lives than any armor modification. On the NVA and VC side, the adaptation was methodical and, in retrospect, revealing about how seriously they took the Australian armoured threat. The 12 months needed to develop an effective mine design, and the 13 months needed to source RPG rounds capable of penetrating the Centurion's armor, tells you something important. The stripped, modified Australian tanks were not the easy targets the critics had predicted. The enemy was working hard to counter them. When effective RPG-7 rounds began appearing in Phuoc Tuy in late 1968 and into 1969, the tactics shifted again. The NVA began targeting exposed crew commanders specifically. In several engagements, the first RPG round was aimed not at the hull, but at the cupola, the position the Australian commanders occupied. This was a direct tactical response to the Australian practice of riding with crew commanders visible. The enemy had identified the vulnerability created by the doctrine and was targeting it. The Australian response was not to seal the hatches. It was to increase awareness. Commanders were briefed on the new targeting pattern. Sectors of observation were tightened. The practice of mutual support between vehicles, one crew covering the angles the other couldn't see, was reinforced. The doctrine of exposed observation was not abandoned because the enemy had adapted to it. It was refined. The M113 evolution told a parallel story. The T-50 turret, eventually standardized across the Australian APC fleet, was accepted as the best available solution. But the tension between protection and responsiveness never fully resolved. In the cavalry troops operating in the reconnaissance role, the preference was consistently for greater situational awareness over greater protection. The vehicles that could see what was coming could respond to it. The vehicles that were sealed against it were surprised by it. What I found most striking, mapping the evolution of Australian armoured operations across the entire 1966 to 1971 deployment, was the direction of travel. Every other major military in Vietnam was adding armor to its vehicles. The Americans were building gun trucks, bolting steel plate to everything, walling their drivers behind armored cabs. The Australians were taking steel off. Different environments, different doctrines, different conclusions from the same jungle. By 1969, the infantry of the 1st Australian Task Force had reached a clear verdict on the modified Centurions. Before Coral Balmoral, some infantry had doubted the usefulness or necessity of the Centurion tanks, the Australian War Memorial record notes. After the battle, the infantry did not like working without them. The phrase used in field accounts was unambiguous. The tanks were worth their weight in gold. This was the same equipment that had been called useless for jungle warfare. The same vehicles that critics had predicted would bog down in rice paddies and be restricted to base areas. Now infantry commanders were refusing to go on operations without them. Across the entire Vietnam deployment, 58 Centurion tanks served in Phuoc Tuy Province. Of those, 42 suffered battle damage, a hit rate of more than 70%. 6 were destroyed beyond repair. 2 tank crewmen were killed in action. Of the approximately 830 personnel who served in Vietnam with the 1st Armoured Regiment, around 70 were wounded and 6 killed. I sat with those numbers for a while. 70% of vehicles took battle damage, 6 vehicles destroyed, 2 crew killed in action across the entire deployment. That is a survival rate that makes no sense until you understand the doctrine. The paradoxical doctrine that said, stripping the protection increased the survivability. The crews could see what was coming. They could respond before it arrived. The modifications that looked like vulnerability were, in the actual mathematics of Phuoc Tuy Province, a form of protection the engineers in Bandiana had not designed. Compare this to the M113s, where 17 of the 20 deaths in the 3rd Cavalry Regiment were killed in action, many by mines, and where the limitation of the vehicle's thin aluminium protection was a constant operational concern. The Centurion crews, in the heavier vehicle, with the stripped and improvised protection doctrine, suffered a proportionally lower rate of fatal casualties. Not because the Centurion's steel was impenetrable. It wasn't. The RPG-7 penetrated it at Binh, but because the crews operating those modified vehicles knew more, saw more, and responded faster than the doctrine written for European armored warfare had anticipated. The North Vietnamese assessment of the Australian tanks was captured in a contemporary AWM report. Because of their grudging respect for the tanks, the Viet Cong are taking pains to learn their measure. That phrase, grudging respect, came after a year of trying to find the Centurion's weakness. After discovering that the vehicles they had been told were slow, clumsy, jungle-unsuitable Koalas were in fact proving extremely difficult to kill and extremely effective at killing. At Binh, the Centurions were described in the official after-action report as a battle-winning factor, an assessment given after a battle in which 3 of the 4 tanks in the initial assault had been damaged by RPG fire. Damaged, not destroyed, not abandoned, still fighting. The crews wounded, some of them, and still commanding from exposed positions because that was what the doctrine required, because exposure and awareness had proved more survivable than protection and blindness. The last Australian Centurion was withdrawn from Vietnam in September 1971. Within months, the 1st Armoured Regiment had begun transitioning to the German-built Leopard 1. The Centurion's Vietnam chapter closed quietly, its lessons filed in after-action reports and regimental histories that, for decades, received far less attention than the major battles they documented. But the lesson the Australian armoured crews had discovered, stripped, improvised, tested in the rubber plantations of Phuoc Tuy, is the kind of lesson that defense forces keep having to rediscover in every subsequent generation. In Iraq and Afghanistan, the same tension played out again with different vehicles. The relationship between protection and situational awareness, between armor and the visibility that sometimes saves more lives than steel. The Australian Vietnam experience, with its careful records of what was removed and why and what was welded on in its place, is one of the earliest and most complete field experiments in that fundamental question. Veterans of the Centurion deployment, when they talk about the modifications, use language that is almost always practical. The skirts compacted the mud. The headlights got ripped off. The radios didn't talk to the infantry. They are describing engineering problems and engineering solutions. But underneath the practicality is a deeper lesson about doctrine. The equipment that arrived in Vietnam was designed for a specific threat environment. The crews adapted it in the field to an actual threat environment. And the gap between those two things, between doctrine and reality, was measured not in specifications, but in lives. When I started this research, I was looking for a story about protection that got refused. What I found was something more interesting. Protection that got redefined by the men who understood, better than any engineer or general far from the rubber trees, what it actually took to survive in Phuoc Tuy Province. The Centurions came home with their sides stripped bare, their headlights repositioned, their radios borrowed from another army entirely. 53 tons of British engineering rebuilt by Australian pragmatism. It wasn't pretty. It was exactly right.